For a busy week in British politics, there is loads to talk about. From reports of a policy blitz to the potential issues with China, speculation over Burnham's cabinet, and findings from the COVID inquiry. This week's episode of the Roundup by News of the Week will cover all of those stories, answering the biggest questions about them. Questions like what is the probability and potential of any actual policy blitz? Who could be in what role, and what could Burnham's cabinet suggest about his party, and what could the impact of Chinese concerns really be? And if you want to read more about all of that or check my sources, head to newsoftheweek.net where you will find the written version of this episode. For now though, let's talk about the news. To kick off this episode, this week, like last week, has been full of speculation over the potential policy of a Burnham government, as more definitive detail will apparently emerge next week. There's been a lot of talk of a policy blitz, but is one possible, and what could it entail? Well, last week there were reports on a new approach to Gaza, the importance of devolution, and plans over welfare. This week there have been reports of a focus on affordable housing, renationalisation of water and gas companies, and social care reform and free bus travel for kids. That is alongside an expansion of technical education, implementing the Starmer government's social media ban and a new AI strategy, as well as new/expanded drilling in the North Sea. Affordable housing could see an increase to the quotas of the houses that would be designated as affordable, rather than new developments and more money. That both the suspected plans over education and bus travel have come from Manchester, have been successful, so they could be introduced nationally. Social care reform, like welfare reform, is the subject of a national inquiry, which will make recommendations to the government's policy in the coming months, and that will probably form part of the Burnham government's policy thinking on those. However, as noted last week, the general goal will likely be to reduce the bill while getting people back to work and delivering a social care system that's free at the point of use. In drilling in the North Sea, Burnham is expected to be in favour of more drilling, even if it could be unpopular with the left of his party. And you might be thinking, Jake, what's the problem with any of those? And in truth, there's probably not much. I mean, many of the suggestions, like increased technical education, social care, welfare reform, even drilling outside of the Labour Party, have cross-party and widespread support in politics and amongst voters. That means they should achieve Burnham's goal of increasing Labour's popularity, dealing with the issues in the country and balancing his party. However, most of them are long-term, ambitious, or quite expensive and with little economic upside. That is apart from the extended North Sea drilling, which could be viewed as a violation of their manifesto, at least in spirit, which would have its own issues for the government. So there are risks which stand to limit the success and popularity of any quote-unquote policy blitz. Also, as some are quite long-term, like social care or welfare reform, any benefit they could have would be limited and might not be seen by Burnham before 2029. Moving on to foreign policy though, maybe concerningly, China has reportedly hit out at nationalisation of British Steel, according to the BBC. The question is, do they have any grounds though, and is this actually significant? Well, firstly, the government renationalised the Scunthorpe Steelworks as it was under threat of closure from its Chinese owners as it was making a loss. The government deemed it too important to close as it supported thousands of jobs and is Britain's only means of making virgin steel, which is widely used by Network Rail and in the construction industry. At the moment, it's costing the government quite a lot of money, reportedly 1.5 million a day according to the National Audit Office. And it's the government's current ambition for domestic steel to be produced by electric arc furnaces in the future, but at the moment can't produce virgin steel. So that's the dilemma for the government. They've chosen to renationalise it rather than let it go because of its capabilities and its value that they think it has. Regardless, the Chinese Commerce Ministry has said the move from the British government infringed upon the legitimate rights and interests of its former owner. As a result, the Chinese government called on Britain to faithfully fulfil its obligations under the China-UK Treaty, investment treaty, and it said the government's decisions undermine the confidence of investing in the UK from China generally. Well, that all sounds vitally important, and investment from the world's second largest economy is important. But unless there is any cost in diplomacy or future deals that are currently unclear, that investment is probably not at risk. In terms of any breach of any treaty, it's likely there could be questions over compensation and how much the British government will owe the Chinese company. That's what the treaty seems to relate to. It's not that we're going to be talking about any suing for ownership or changing of ownership again. It's just this seems to be more of a question of compensation, and this just seems to be the question of compensation which is set against the Chinese government's threat of a lack of investment. So moving on to general politics, this week has seen massive speculation over Burnham's cabinet, which is the major story in this section where we talk about anything other than the government's politics. Other than the government's policy. So in terms of Burnham's cabinet, there's still loads of speculation about who's in and who's out and who's changing. But let's look at who's most likely and what the significance of any changes could be. Well, we already know that Burnham will want to strike a balance in the party to create a bit of a broader church, which would be more inclusive of different views in Labour than Starmer's government was. Naturally, he will also be seeking to reward those who followed him and helped him get to number 10, and he will put people in positions that will agree with his delivery. That means there are a number of changes which are more than likely to happen at this point. For example, Rachel Reeves, who is deeply unpopular, is set to be replaced, whereas Streeting, who has backed Burnham for a few weeks now, and was actually a challenger of his originally, could be in line for a top job according to reports. Louise Hay, who has been a Burnham ally pretty consistently, is tipped by multiple outlets to lead the Cabinet Office as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Another ally, Lucy Powell, Labour's Deputy Leader, could be becoming Deputy Prime Minister if reports are to be believed. Well, there's a few other changes that you'd expect to see but aren't as certain as the ones I just noted. Yvette Cooper has been reported as a possibility for multiple different roles. She could take foreign policy or as foreign secretary, or has been tipped as an outside and continuity candidate for Chancellor. The thinking is that the respect she has internationally could be crucial for Burnham, but the reason for the uncertainty about her role is there's uncertainty about other positions and other people who could be the Chancellor. Also expected to have roles are Mayata Fambula and Annalise Midgley, who are MPs of the 2024 intake and who have supported Burnham's rise. They are expected to get roles in devolution and as the Chief Whip, respectively. Angela Rayner is expected to return into Cabinet as well in a social care role where she reportedly shares Burnham's vision. The most speculation and the most uncertainty has been over the role of Chancellor and who could fill it. Shabana Mahmood, the party's right, is one candidate. Miliband of the party's left is another candidate, and both have their respective merits and pitfalls. Well, on a very basic level, Mahmood could be argued to have more market credibility, whereas Miliband could be popular with the party. Going into this weekend, Burnham has said he made no decision, and regardless of whether that's true, the internal dynamics and promises made are quite hard to guess at in terms of who out of those two is most likely to be Chancellor. Yvette Cooper, who's been suggested, like I said, is like a less likely option, and that's purely because of her perceived value in foreign policy and the importance of the role in making his cabinet. Overall, the speculation on the chancellorship impacts a lot of the roles which we've just talked about for the others. It will also then have an impact on the overall balance of the cabinet and the significance of who's in which role. However, because of the desire to balance the party, the need to reward both followers and potential rivals, the names that I noted as being fairly likely are fairly likely, and if their position was unchallenged, as some of them were, they might well get the positions that the media has said. That could then lead to a more balanced Labour Party, which is more unified and more focused on Burnham's ideas, as well as being more popular to the people. But until we really know who's Chancellor and what the impact of that could be, the rest of it is uncertain too. Moving on to stats and trends though, aside from Burnham's cabinet, there's been an inquiry into previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government, and that is the focus of the stats and trends section. So Sky has reported on the COVID inquiry, finding Boris Johnson's government wasted quote-unquote vast sums on PPE equipment. The question is, what does this mean for the government now and back then? Well, the fifth iteration of the COVID inquiry, which looked at the procurement of safety equipment, has found that there was overbuying and purchasing of substandard equipment. That was to the extent that Baroness Hallett called the scale of waste vast. Aside from this, policy over expansion of supply chains was misguided, with some suppliers reportedly receiving preferential treatment due to their personal connections with the government. Like the previous reports into the other areas of the government's response so far, they've been labelled as chaotic, and this report has seemingly found issues with the government's decision-making, like the call to arms over PPE or a failure to restock government supplies properly. No doubt that this and the other reports have suggested the government's response has been flawed, and to that end the government have noted the report makes for sobering reading, and the government said they will respond in due course. Well, the inquiry cannot force recommendations to become law, so it can't force policy, but the report has recommended for the establishment of proper systems to aid the supply chain, as well as to engage in international trade of emergency equipment to increase the use of technology. We don't know if those recommendations will be enacted or whether the government will have its own policy at this stage, but it does pour doubt on the Johnson government's COVID response and give more clarity over how the government could help this not happen again in the future. So that's the end of this week's episode. That was a lot of news, so let's quickly zoom out and review. Firstly, Burnham's potential policy blitz could reinvigorate Labour and balance the party while delivering, but the possibility of any blitz could be limited in practice due to the long-term nature of some of the policies. In foreign policy, Scunthorpe's still concerns could spark issues for the future of Chinese investment, but it seems more likely this will end up just being an issue over compensation, and that's due to international agreements between China and the UK. In general politics, there's been much speculation over a Burnham cabinet. While there are some more or less nailed-on names, some big positions will have a huge effect on the government as a whole, and those are still unclear. And finally, in news and stats and trends, the fifth iteration of the COVID inquiry found issues with procurement, waste and contract issues for the government, but it's still ongoing overall. That's it, that's everything. Let me know what you thought by commenting on either the stories or my coverage of them, and if you want to see more from News of the Week, like, subscribe and share this with a friend. I'll be back next week with the news, but for now, bye!